Okay, yeah, I'm Elizabeth Digby-Britten. I'm Viroqua WI. I am their clan. I have a bachelor's in education and a master's in professional development. I've taught adjunct at UW La Crosse. I worked for the Ho-Chunk Nation, and I currently work for the YWCA doing restorative justice in our schools and with the county. And today, kind of was asked if I would come speak, and that's always the challenge: is what do people want to hear about? And I kind of decided to stick with some more contemporary topics right now because these have, I think, gotten a little more media attention, and it's nice when we maybe talk about contemporary stuff than just history. So that's kind of why we're here today. And the title is Schools Shouldn't Have Cemeteries, so the residential school horrors and missing and murdered Indigenous women and children. And I've been struggling with, like, how do I exactly explain why they connect or why it's important? Basically, it's just their genocide tactics and another way of erasing Indigenous people from our land. And so that's kind of the theme that we're going to go with. I would like to recognize that the city of Viroqua occupies the land of the Ho-Chunk people. Please take a moment to celebrate and honor this ancestral Ho-Chunk land and the sacred lands of all Indigenous people. And speaking of lands, I just wanted to share this slide in case you weren't familiar with the traditional nations here in Wisconsin. This shows you kind of prior to European contact, whose land was whose in the state of Wisconsin. And so we are on Ho-Chunk land. I think that's just an important thing to see and recognize. Also, this is just a list of the tribes, the Native nations that are here in Wisconsin. We have 6 that are Ojibwe. Your history books and the government kind of call us Chippewa. It's because they couldn't say Ojibwa or Ojibwe, it became Chippewa. So it was the colonizer's name for us. We also have Menominee, Ho-Chunk. The colonizers named them Winnebago, but they're Ho-Chunk. So you'll see history books a lot of times call them Winnebago. We have the Potawatomi. The Oneida are called part of the Iroquois Nation. Iroquois is also a colonizer name. It's Haudenosaunee would be the proper term. And then we have the Stockbridge Mohicans. And then we have one that is not federally recognized here in Wisconsin, and that's the Brothertown. And in order to get federal recognition, there's a bunch of things you have to be able to have. And one of it is you have to still have people to speak your language. And there were a lot of things that were done so that we couldn't speak our language. And when we talk about residential school, we'll get into that. So Brothertown lives with the Stockbridge Mohicans, and they're not recognized, but Brothertown has taken them, or Stockbridge have taken them in. And the name Stockbridge Mohican, our history books also call it Stockbridge Munsee. Munsee is the name of the town, it's also not their name, so they're Stockbridge Mohicans. So it's just really important to know the names of the nations that live here and what our government calls them as opposed to what they would like to be called. And for the Ojibwe, we have 6 different bands. So we've got Lac du Flambeau, Le Coudray, Red Cliff, Bag River, Mole Lake, and St. Croix. And so we're all Ojibwe, but we got split out into 6 separate groups because had they left us together, we would have had way more power if we'd been this big group together. So they split us out according to hunting parties, and that's why we have 6 different ones here in Wisconsin. We also have Ojibwe people that live in Minnesota, Michigan, and Canada. So they're kind of spread throughout. So it's just kind of important to have some history. When we look at land, 1607, all of the US was land held by Native Americans. And you can gradually see how it's progressed, that the land is no longer owned by Indigenous people. And so that's kind of an important thing to think about too when we do land recognition, why that's important. And then I want to start talking about our residential schools. One of the things that I think is terrifying is Hitler, when he created his concentration camps, he looked towards how the US government created reservations, and that's how he did his concentration camps. So one picture shows Hitler and a mass grave, and one picture shows the US government and Indigenous people buried in a mass grave. There were so many similarities in how people were treated. And like I said, Hitler really admired the genocide tactics that the United States government had used. And so it's just kind of a thing to think about. I never like to think that Hitler looked at the US and admired us, but he certainly did when it came to reservations. With our reservations then came our, that slide you can't read very well, became our boarding schools, as our history books call them. We call them residential schools, and I think now there's even a lot of pushback that it shouldn't even be called a residential school, that it needs to be called a prison camp, because kids were not allowed to leave. And how many schools do you know have cemeteries on the premise? Like, I think that's kind of one of those really important things to think about. And when it came to the boarding schools, the residential schools, they were founded by Colonel Pratt, and his goal was to get kids off of the reservations, and he believed that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. So he said, kill the Indian and save the man, is basically what his belief was, that they were going to assimilate children through total immersion. And I actually want to go back a second too. I forgot to, oh, maybe I can't go back. I'll find it later, but there was a slide in the beginning that, on the top, and it said John Quagan, and it was up there, and I included that because my great-grandmother was a Quagan, and this young child came from a reservation, so had to have been a relative in there somehow. I've not done the genealogy to exactly say, first, you know, if it was a cousin or how exactly, but he was buried at Carlisle Indian School, and so when I saw that, I just went, that's really sad to know that I have a relative for sure that is in a cemetery at a residential school. So anyways, so Colonel Pratt decided that he was going to create these residential schools and kill the Indian, save the man. So what they would do is they would round up kids, and they would take them about age 5, sometimes younger, and they would bring them to the residential school, and families would know, like, they're coming, and sometimes they would try and hide some of the kids, and they maybe only send 1 or 2. And in the 1970s, when we hit the peak of enrollment, there were about 60,000 kids, and we know there's been documented cases of abuse, physical, mental, sexual abuse that happened in these residential schools. And for us, knowing, you know, 1970s, I was born in 1975. The residential schools closed in like the 1990s, so those are parents my age. So if you were sent off to a residential school and now you're a parent, like, this is still impacting our generations today. When it comes to the residential schools in Wisconsin, we had 8. And so yeah, they closed in the 80s and 90s. When the students were to arrive, so this is where they'd be about 5 years old, and they would show up, and students would get to the schools, and they would strip them, they would delouse them, they would cut their hair, which for a lot of Indigenous kids, that was not something that had ever happened. That meant mourning, and so that was really hard for them. They would rename them, so imagine being 5 or older and now being given a whole new name. And then you were forced to speak English, and even if they didn't know English, they had to speak English immediately. And if they were caught speaking their language, often they would get beat. And different things would happen, and there'd be punishments. Kids were not allowed to leave. We've learned through Canada, during residential schools, they performed a lot of medical experiments using diet. Like, what happens if we give them an all-dairy diet? What happens if we deny them vitamin C? You know, they documented how diet can impact, and so then when disease would hit these residential schools, a lot of them would die. And then that's where, like, some would get buried. There's a few where they'd, like, or they'll have a name if they use the English name. Some are unmarked, and then as we're learning, there are, like, mass graves kind of everywhere. And so these kids then would go spend their time there. They'd hit maybe 16, 18. They'd be allowed to go back to their reservations. How do you think that went for kids? So they've now been stripped of their entire culture, and now they go back to where things are traditional. How would that feel?
Mixed up.
Terrible, mixed up. How also, like, they now lived at this residential school, and the only adult figures are the ones that are beating them and abusing them. So now they go home. How do they learn how to be a parent? You learn from the parents you have or the adults around you. And so unfortunately, like I said, if this went up until the 90s, which I graduated in 93. So there are still adults my age that have kids that are trying to figure that out. I mean, if they didn't, like let's say their parents were at the residential schools and didn't really know how to parent them. Like this takes a long time to unlearn this damage and this type of abuse. There's some great videos out there by White Bison, Wellbriety, and it's free, you can find it. But they talk about how for a lot of the kids, going their whole life and never hearing I love you from an adult, like during that time period, and then raising kids and never being able to say I love you, because they just didn't know how to do that. And so these things really impacted us. And again, it's a genocide tactic. You remove the children, you kind of kill the culture, you kill the language. And, you know, like I said, we're still dealing with that. I worked for a few years for the Ho-Chunk Nation working with youth and families. And that was one of the things of definitely understanding how to help families find resources and how to understand some of this historical trauma and how to work through it. Can anyone tell what those are? What do they look like? Who do you think they're for? Yeah, they're pretty tiny. Those were unearthed at Carlisle, which is one of the biggest residential schools in Pennsylvania, Carlisle Indian School. And so they found a set of those, and it's just a terrifying thought of how many kids were handcuffed. When we talk about this historical trauma, one of the things to think about is that it manifests itself in different ways. So people who have a lot of trauma, historical trauma, they also say that the trauma is built into our DNAs. It's changed us. They've done studies with Holocaust families and victims, and they've seen how that trauma has been passed down. No one's ever studied that for Indigenous people, but we know we have it too, that it just gets passed in our DNA. But what ends up happening is a lot of this stuff, because it's not acknowledged, people don't talk about it. We then have a lot of just depression, high mortality rates of alcohol abuse, different stuff like that, child abuse. Again, when you've only had people beat you as an adult figure, you don't understand that that's maybe not how to handle stuff, and domestic violence. So we are a country that's been built on the genocide of one race and the enslavement of another, and I don't think we have enough of these conversations. Before I go to this, I don't know, did anyone have any questions? I know that I say that I have some slides out of order. Not as organized as I thought today. Any questions up until this point? Because I can take questions here, or we can make them together. Okay. So this slide I have in here because we're going to talk about then to what happens with our Indigenous women. For Indigenous women, we are 2.5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than any other ethnic group. Our murder rates, I think, is 10 times more likely in different states and different areas. We have about 17% of Indigenous women are stalked in their lifetime, as opposed to like 8.2 for white women, 6.5 for Black women, 4.5 for Asian Pacific Islander. And these are like important statistics to know that this is kind of what we face as Indigenous women. Part of the reason we'll get that one. Pocahontas. Has anyone ever seen the Disney movie? Anyone tell me the story that Disney tells us? Anyone know the Disney story?
They tell us it's a love story, that, you know, the white settlers come and they want gold and that they haven't, and that, of course, they use, unfortunately, the word savages in there, and, yeah, it's more of a love story, and I don't know if they really portray it very well at all.
Yeah, definitely, Disney portrays it as a love story. How old do you think they make Pocahontas? Like, how old do you think she's portrayed to be in that movie? 20?
Yeah, I was going to say like 18.
Hopefully the age of consent, right? Like that's what we're hoping for, right? True story of Pocahontas. She was between, I think they actually say 9 to 14 years old when she met John Smith. It was not a love story. They did not have a big romance. Disney can't portray that type of a love story, it wouldn't be Disney, right? If it was a 10-year-old and an adult man. And so Disney has sexualized Pocahontas. And that's an important thing to think about. When we go to the true story of Pocahontas, Pocahontas wasn't even her name. It was actually her mom's name. Her mom died while giving birth to her. Somehow it ended up being her nickname. The whole stuff, John Smith, whatever, however she saved him. But what ended up happening to her is she was married off, stolen. She already had an Indigenous husband and child, and then she got married off to a white guy. And then they sent her back to Europe. And her tribe believes that she was murdered. They try and claim she died because of disease, but they believe that she was truly murdered somewhere at her time of arriving in Europe. So her story isn't really like the great romance that our history books try to make it out to be. And so we do look at her as our first stolen sister when it comes to our missing and murdered Indigenous women. She was like our first documented one that we can say right here is kind of where it started. And the unfortunate thing with Disney, if you look at how she's portrayed, she's the beautiful Indian maiden. We're given usually two roles when it comes to our portrayal. We're either the beautiful Indian maiden or we're the ugly Indigenous woman, and they use an S word for that I don't like to say. Those are kind of our two choices. But this is definitely sexualization of someone who should be portrayed to be about 12 years old, kind of says on here. So when we look at that, and then we look at Land O'Lakes, I gotta tell you, I don't know if you can see the bottom one very well. They use Indigenous women to sell things like we have Leinenkugel and then Land O'Lakes. When I was younger, so I'm Ojibwe through my dad, and then my mom is German. And when I was younger, I remember one of my uncles pulling the family, like the adults, into the kitchen at my grandma's house. And he took the Land O'Lakes butter and he folded it, because there used to be a way too you could fold it. But if you look here, those are supposed to be knees, but there used to be directions on the back of the butter to fold it so they're her boobs. You can Google this. It's out there. Like, it's not, Elizabeth didn't just make this up. And I remember that happening. And so those are on there. And so this is a sexualization of Indigenous women that was in your grocery store, right? Leinenkugel too, another Indigenous maiden, used to sell beer. Just kind of interesting how that imagery is used, and just people pass by it and don't think anything of it. Thankfully, Land O'Lakes and Leinenkugel have both pulled the Indigenous women off of there, which is a great progress for us. But again, it's just that sexualization of women, and then we wonder why things happen, right? And I'm not going to remember her name. So Gabby, is it the lady that went missing in Wyoming, Patruo? But I'm going to say it wrong. So everyone raise your hand if you're familiar with that case, right? It's kind of heard it around the news, right? So it was a big deal. This white woman went missing in Wyoming. We all heard about it. There were multiple articles, lots of publicity. In Wyoming, from 2011 to 2020, there have been 710 Indigenous people that have gone missing from Wyoming. Have any of you heard any of those that have gone missing? You're shaking your head, yeah.
I saw a documentary on that. One of the cable channels, they were talking about it. They go missing, nobody investigates them.
Yeah.
The local authorities don't have no authority because it's a reservation, federal land.
Yep.
And the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they're not doing nothing about it. Nobody investigates it, they're gone.
Yep. But we're also not getting the media coverage, right? Like, if we could get some of the media coverage, maybe that would help too. But when there's no media coverage to announce that it's happening, that's a terrifying statistic to see. And so 85% were kids, 57% were female. And so we know that this is happening across the US and Canada. And like I said, these are out of order, because I apparently, when I was doing this, did not get them in the right order. This actually is a map of Canada, of all of the residential schools in Canada, where there are probably more bodies. So I apologize, I'm a little out of. And then this is one of like residential schools in the United States too. So we're gonna, as we get to more of those, and then our number for the children's bodies that have been recovered, we're at 7,310 for the US and Canada. So just, That just was a list of, but we'll go back to missing and murdered. Tried to be organized, didn't do so well. For Indigenous women, we know in the US that there are 5,712 that have been missing up until 2016. Only 116 of these cases are in the Department of Justice database. And the number of cases between 2005 and 2009, the US attorneys declined to prosecute, were 67%, those were sexual abuse. And 96% some reservations are the number of sexual violence against Native women, so 96% that were committed by non-natives, that's it. So when we look at statistics, and it gets all complicated like you said, so there's all these things that come into play. If it is a non-Indigenous person committing a crime on Indigenous land, there's an inability to prosecute sometimes because it's tribal land, and then the US government will decline to intervene or do anything. And so we have a bunch of laws that people are trying to work on too, like there's a bunch of things out there to try and update and help with some of this because this is where we run into that. And then when it happens, it doesn't get logged in the Department of Justice database. In Canada, there's a stretch of highway where I feel like it was 500 Indigenous women had gone missing. Same thing happens in Canada, like women go missing, it's not getting logged, it's not getting kept, people aren't keeping track. And so that's where we're seeing a change. Minnesota, was it 2 years ago, started a missing and murdered Indigenous women task force. And in Wisconsin, I feel like it was last year, they just started one as well, so that they can start logging some of these missing women and children. One of the things to know with Minnesota, Duluth has the largest rate of exporting human trafficking. People go out on ships in Duluth. It's like it's well known, especially if you live in Duluth, that people are going out. And Indigenous women and children are sought after because they're considered exotic. Goes back to all that sexualization of Indigenous women. It's all those things that we see. It's all tied together. When it comes to the cities, with the highest number, this is just a few. We have Seattle has 45, Albuquerque 37, Anchorage 31, Tucson 31. Like it just kind of shows you like some of them that have gone missing. We do have missing women in Wisconsin too. There's a list of those as well. We have ones that have been pretty recent too. I'm trying to remember if it was Menominee, which reservation it was, but there are ones that have disappeared. We've got some young men that were Ho-Chunk that have disappeared, like 2016, I think it was, and that there's just no media attention when it comes to that. And then in Canada, too, they're trying to, there's been a lot of pushback. So they now are saying there's about 4,000 missing and murdered women in Canada, and that they're promising to do some funding. And that was June 3rd that they made that statement. And so they're saying too, like, Indigenous women are 12 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than any other woman in Canada. And so what is interesting about these statistics are we went from being 100% of the population. Does anybody know what percent of population Indigenous people are now in the United States?
It's less than 2%.
Yeah, it's like, I would say less than 1%. And so when you see numbers like this and rates like this, that's where it gets pretty scary. Any other questions, comments? Because I talk super fast and I'm gonna have to slow down a bit.
I had heard on a podcast that there was something with the Canadian police that they would take Indigenous people, just out them going nowhere without them on. Is that?
I don't doubt that. Like, I know that happens. I shouldn't say necessarily that it was the police, but I mean that can happen where people are just dropped off in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, specifically essentially.
Yeah. And when we talk about these things, one of the other things to talk about too is Indigenous kids and the foster care system. So we have what's called ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, that was written in the 1970s because they knew Indigenous kids were being removed from Indigenous homes at a higher rate. Now, if you tie in, you know, what happened in residential schools, you know, parenting skills are just different because for some, it just isn't there. And instead of trying to help the families get the skills, they were removing kids. So then they started to where, and then, you know, it's bad when the government has to enact a policy saying, hey, you need to address this. So what they did is they enacted the Indian Child Welfare Act, which if an Indigenous child was being removed from a home, they were supposed to contact the tribe if they were an enrolled tribal member, and then try and place them with another Indigenous family so that way culture could stay, they could kind of do that stuff. And so that was happening. Well, then Wisconsin was ignoring that, and they had to write the Wisconsin Indian Child Welfare Act, where they have to write it right in for social workers because they weren't paying attention to ICWA. So and that was like even in the 1990s then, like it was still a really, really high rate that kids were being removed. And so again, just another way that when kids are removed from families, we can't pass on culture, we can't pass on tradition. It's kind of the genocide. But a lot of it has to do with just understanding different types of parenting, because when we look at families and we use one skill set, like this is how we think kids should be parented, but culture says it's maybe this way, we're judging it differently. And so that's where we're trying to educate social workers too when it comes to the removal, that they understand those pieces. So I guess that's just kind of another genocide tactic to that. And so this too just, I mean, it's hard to get exact data because I was looking and because nothing's really reported the way it needs to be. So here they're just saying there were 506 cases identified across 71 urban cities. 128 were Indigenous women, 280 were cases of murdered Indigenous women, 98 were cases that with an unknown status, and 29 is like the average age. So this was put out by the Urban Indian Health Institute. And I think when I had done the research prior, one of the youngest Indigenous children to die was about 1 year old. And I think one of the oldest Indigenous women, I can't remember, she was in her 80s. And so it's kind of interesting to hear the just average ages, you know, kind of across the board when it comes to that. Something else to say too. Other thoughts, questions? Go ahead.
So I recently, the study came out from the Department of Justice on, you know, crime over the last year in the U.S. And they said that, you know, of course, hate crimes are increasing against all cultures. But they said that hate crimes against transgender folks, it's hard to get an actual study because they say 4 out of 5 people don't ever report it just because they know nothing's going to get done. So these, you know, the statistics are shocking, but has a study been done on that of like what is the best guess of how many of these cases don't go reported because nothing, you know, as a culture won't do anything for it?
So yeah, so that's a good question. So in Indigenous culture, like the Ho-Chunk word for, I can't remember if it was police or for the social workers, was the grabbers, because those were the ones that came in and would remove children for the residential schools. So when you name a group of people the grabbers, if you think about how perception is towards groups. So for Indigenous people, when it comes to the police, we have a higher rate of death by police than Black people. And also we have a higher rate of incarceration by population too. Like our percentages in jail are ridiculously high. And so for sure, people don't want to go to the police. Like they see the police, they're not going to talk to the police, they're not going to report that. And I've done some work with training like the La Crosse Police Department on some of that. And one of the things we did is like, we did a thing on unconscious bias for a minute. And I asked them to close their eyes. And I just said, okay, close your eyes, and you can do this right now too, close your eyes. And I'm gonna say Native American, American Indian, what comes to mind? What do you see, what imagery, what thoughts do you have? Does anybody wanna share? And there's no judgment, please don't, there's no judgment. I did this with the police, that was an interesting, what do you think most people say? Let's put it that way. What do you think people say when you say American Indian, Indigenous, Native American? What words or images come to mind?
Well, I know for me, like, especially with growing up with grandparents who loved old westerns, like, it would be that stereotypical headdress and wardrobe that was portrayed in media and movies and all of those things. picture that first goes, and then after a second, for me, it does change. But I could see that being a lot of people's perception.
So if you had to put a word to that image, what word would you use? Or what word is commonly used with Indigenous people? Descriptive word. Thank you.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry. So like savages. So if that's like the first thing that comes to mind when you think about Indigenous people, when it comes to our police, if that's what they see in the Westerns, and we can talk about Westerns in a minute because that's one of my favorite things to talk about too. When that's the first thing that comes to mind is savage, if you're having an interaction as a police officer with an Indigenous person, what might the first thought be? Right? That's our unconscious bias. And so it was interesting to do that with the police department because that's a lot of like bow and arrow, you know, you think about the half-dressed Native American man, you know, like, so what they would list were a lot of those unconscious things that we learned from the media, we learned from the Westerns. And so same thing is like if you ask, and I haven't done this with a group of Indigenous people, but I asked the police to think now, like if you're an Indigenous person and you had to think about the police, what do you think they think? So their first thought is going to be, I'm going to get shot, I'm going to get arrested, you know. And so it's important to understand how we have bias, you know, amongst ourselves towards different groups. So to answer the question about the police, yeah, definitely there's bias. I've seen it. You know, I've had families that are worried about other family members, but they're not going to go to CPS, because if you go to CPS as an Indigenous person, what's going to happen? Your kids are going to get removed, right? And so they'll come and talk to somebody else before going to CPS, before going to the police. So definitely. And then Westerns. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Westerns because I love Westerns. There's a really, really good documentary called Real Injun, and it's ReelInjun. I think you can find it. If you can still find it on Netflix, but it's a documentary that talks about Indigenous people in film. And one of the best things is talking about the John Wayne movies. Anybody watch John Wayne? Okay. So hilarious thing, my grandpa and my dad, who were Ojibwe, loved Louis L'Amour. I grew up reading Louis L'Amour. I still will say I enjoy some Louis L'Amour. Are there some stereotypes? Absolutely. But when they would do some of the movies, the John Wayne movies, the Louis L'Amour movies, they would use Italians to portray the Indigenous people. Hilarious, because go back and watch them now, because it's really funny once you know that, to go back and watch a John Wayne movie. I'm trying to remember, which one is the one? I don't remember it right now. There's one, though, that I went back and watched, and I just laughed. But anyways, they talk about the costumes, and so that headband with the feather on it, that is not a traditional headband for any Indigenous group. That was created by Hollywood to keep the wigs on the Italian actors in those Western movies.
I think ironized coating is one of the most well-known.
Say that again?
Ironized coating.
Yep.
From Iowa.
Yep.
It was quite Iowa. He was Italian.
Yep.
He
Yep.
was an Indian.
He was a fake Indian. We love fake Indians.
And he made a lot of money.
He did. Totally did.
He used to have a road show.
Well, it's going to bug me that I can't remember the John Wayne movie, too. I'll have to look it up when I'm done. But so go back and watch that. But in that Real Injun, they talk about that. And so when it comes to our kids and our self-esteem, too, if you think about movies, how many movies show contemporary Indigenous people?
Peter Pan.
Yeah,
I just saw it for the first time, and I was like, this grotesque was appalled. Talking about Pocahontas, I thought it was another parallel example of Disney.
I'm going to embarrass my kid because my kid is here with me. And there's two movies I've never allowed in our house. Pocahontas and Peter Pan. And I've told them, like, if you're ever anywhere, try not to watch it. But I think you might have been somewhere where they played it for you. You don't remember? Yeah. Because, yes, Peter Pan is another really bad one. It's just, yeah. But when it comes to the portrayal in the movies, like, when we play the movies, like, are they set contemporary or is it usually historical, like in the past? Usually historical. Same with books. That's why, too, like, I have a bunch of books over there, and I tried to bring, so I have some that are more, like, in the past, and then I always try when I talk to kids, bring contemporary books, and if I'm going to read a story, I read a contemporary story. I also like to do the thing, too, of, like, when we talk about stereotypes, and I have my mask on, so you can't see my face, but I have white passing privilege, right? I can walk in a room, and most people will just assume I'm white. But it's one of those things I'll ask kids, like, am I what you expected as your speaker today, knowing I'm here to talk about being Indigenous. And I love it when kids are like, no, you weren't what I thought. I'm like, yeah, because that's our unconscious bias, right? But back to the movies. So our history, the movies that we play, when it only shows in the past, when the books that we read and our history books only teach about it in the past, for our kids and our young people, they don't think that they have a future. And so that's why it's super important that we do more contemporary stuff and we teach about future things or having contemporary movies. And I always will use the book Twilight and the movie Twilight. And you can hate it all you want, not the best writing, whatever. But for our Indigenous kids, the wolf pack in there, and if you don't know Twilight, it's a whole thing, but there's a group of characters in there that are all Indigenous, and they hired all Indigenous actors except for Taylor Lautner. He was the only one that wasn't. And for our kids, that was the first time they got to see themselves in a popular movie, contemporary. Like, it was huge. It was fun taking the kids to go see that movie because they got to see themselves in present day. And now lately, I think we're having a pretty good swing in our media. Res Dogs, there's Trickster.
The one alien show.
Oh yeah, Resident Alien. Like there's some really good shows out there right now that use Indigenous people, and it's not like a stereotype stuff, or they're not the main plot either. Like that's always nice when it's kind of more just like they're a person in the show, and then they talk about real things. And so there's just been a nice change, kind of swing with that. And I think Standing Rock really helped us as a group to finally get some media attention. And what it did is it brought us all kind of together to all the nations that could be there and speak up. And I think that really helped push that forward in our media, that people are seeing more Indigenous stuff. But kind of went on a tangent there about how, yeah, it's needing to make sure to have contemporary stuff. Because for our Indigenous kids too, they have the highest suicide rate out of any ethnic group. And so that's also terrifying, that they don't have that mental health support, that they're not getting, role models that are identified as being Indigenous. Like, those are all things that I'm pretty passionate about, making sure kids see some of that stuff. Yeah. But other questions? Still got tons of time. We talk way too fast.
I guess for me, some of the questions are, especially with all these terrifying statistics, and you had mentioned kind of that movement of murdered and missing Indigenous women and children. Are there ways that we who are here today are able to support or, come alongside and kind of be that ally as well?
Definitely. I think one of the biggest things too is when you see some of this on social media, like there are Facebook groups that are dedicated solely to missing Indigenous people. Share those posts as much as Gabby got attention, making sure that other group, women get it and other people. We have noticed that there is more attention now, and so they are recovering Indigenous people that have gone missing quicker, which is a wonderful thing. But definitely pushing there, write to your legislators, and say why, please keep putting money towards this or keep doing this. And then, like I said, there are different groups out there that if you use Facebook or, use Google to just look them up, there are groups out there dedicated solely to making sure that this attention is there. Same goes for like the residential schools and trying to find the missing children that are buried places. Like when you see that information, share it. Talk about it, like leave here today and share one thing that you learned today and just keep the conversation going, because I think that's what's important, that we do that. Support Indigenous filmmakers. What was the film you were talking about that you saw about the Wyoming? Do you remember the name of the documentary? Or it's okay.
It was documentaries on either history or investigation, discovery, one of the two.
Okay.
And it was all about all these people missing out west.
Yeah. Watching things like that, supporting the filmmakers and the people bringing that attention, just sharing it. Yeah.
It was a very good book. I didn't read, but it was made into a movie. I rented from this library called The Education of Poetry.
Yeah.
And I thought it was very good. It was the first time I had ever heard or seen anything of that kind in context, and I thought it was very good. What did you think? Did you see it?
I haven't seen it. I've heard, so from what I've heard, it's pretty good. So like one of the things I like to do too is authenticating like the sources, and I think that book was written by a non-Indigenous person, so there's a little bit of like some problematic like pieces that they just wouldn't know, but I think it's gotten pretty good support by Indigenous people. So I do know that, you know, most people who've seen it have said it's pretty good. There's some other really good books out there, and the only one I can think of off the top of my head is called Fatty Legs, and it's about a young lady in a residential school in Canada, and she writes the story of going off and then just kind of like really pushing the nuns, like she didn't want to conform, she just, you know, different stuff like that. Lakota Woman is another one that is really good. There's a movie to watch too, and there's a book. And she also talks about her experience at residential schools. So that's Mary Crodog who wrote that, and I liked that one as well. Like those are good ones. I think we're seeing more stories being written now too as this information is coming out. I don't know if I've seen a whole lot of documentaries about residential school except for the Well Variety by White Bison, which is free online. I recommend watching that because it's told by elders and their experiences. So I always like that piece. So
We do have, I know for sure, the book Fatty Legs here at the library. It was on display for the month of November. So if you really want to check that out, it is here.
yeah. I have resources over there too, and so one of the best ones are the Indian Tribes of Wisconsin. So if you don't have this one here, this one was written by Patty Lowe, and she worked for Wisconsin Public Television for a long time. She's now, I think, teaching in Chicago. And so she did a lot of research for the tribes here in Wisconsin, so I highly recommend that. If you know a kid, this is a 4th grade book she then wrote to go with it, kind of written at a 4th grade level, but for 4th and 5th grade learners. One of the things in Wisconsin, we have the great fishing wars between the Ojibwe tribes. We learned that we still have the right to hunt and fish off our reservations. And there was a lot of hate towards Indigenous people for doing that. And I was in high school at the time when a lot of that kind of hit. And so Act 31 was passed in 1981, no, 1992, just kidding. And so in that, here's a book written by J.P. Leary, who used to work for the Department of Public Instruction and now is a professor at UW Green Bay. And so it just talks about that history and why that's important to teach about it. So in our schools, we're supposed to learn in 4th grade, 8th grade, and one more time in high school, you're supposed to learn all the tribes and the history. And very few of our schools use that information, but they're great resources. This is one too that on how to tell if the book is a good source for Indigenous people, like or Indigenous stories, how to evaluate for bias. Love that one. I got really cranky last week. I don't believe in celebrating Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was an act of genocide. It was celebrated like the Pilgrims. That first meal that was had, walk back over here, was it 90 warriors, and it was only men that had that meal with anybody know the name of the tribe that was involved with that first Thanksgiving? That's my favorite question. Say it, Joe.
I don't actually remember, but I usually started with an
W. The Wampanoag. And so they had that meal, and then it was warriors, and it was 3 days of peace talks is what it was. And so we're taught that it was this, way of celebrating. And what they ended up doing is within a year, they ended up killing off that entire tribe. And then what the government, so that act of Thanksgiving was enacted to kind of just commemorate the genocide, but we're not really taught that piece if you start doing that research. And so the Wampanoag, so that tribe or that group that was murdered, there were other branches of Wampanoag people, so they're not all dead, but that group that had that meal with them. They call that Thanksgiving as the National Day of Mourning for them, and so I get super cranky at Thanksgiving time. Because what we teach in our school is not the true story, and so this is a really great one. It's Thanksgiving, a Native perspective. There aren't that many kids' books out there that really want to tell that story, And then they talk about there's some journal entries in here that talk about the food that was served, and all they know for sure was that there was deer and turkey. there's no other really discussion of what the other foods were. So I always laugh when people are like, I'm gonna have a traditional meal. And I'm like, you don't really know what that was. In my house, there's a cookbook called The Sous Chef. I don't know if you have a copy here. And it's pre-colonized foods. And so that's what we had started doing in our house is we serve all pre-colonized foods. And that's kind of how we celebrate that day, is like just remembering what the food was like prior to being colonized. So those are some there. And then, like I said, I got a bunch of other ones. Like this is like a really new one that I have not read yet. Firekeeper's Daughter. It's really hot right now. Have you read it?
Yeah, and I really liked it, and I was hoping that I could like it.
Yes, you can like it. Not that I'm the sale, but just the people I know that have read it and have loved it. And she actually was in Green Bay speaking just a few weeks ago, and so I have to listen, zoom in. So that's the benefit of Zoom right now, is you can do some of these things. And so she wrote that, and so I'm really excited to read that. But when it comes to like our schools and elementary school, the Birchbark House, which is by Louise Erdrich, if I say the name right, Erdrich.
I do believe it's Erdrich.
She has a bookstore in Minneapolis called the Birchbark Bookstore. Love going there because you get to support an Indigenous business owner and author. But this is one of my favorite books. So instead of reading Little House on the Prairie, like I really recommend that kids read this. And then it's a whole series.
Yeah, we have a lot of her things both in the children's section and in the adult section as well.
The Merrill Thieves is a contemporary YA book that I absolutely love. And then here's the sequel, which I have not read yet because I'm behind on the reading. But this is really, really good. I highly recommend that. As an adult, I love these. How I Became a Ghost is an interesting one too. This is from the Choctaw Trail of Tears. So we know that the Cherokee were forced to march here, and actually I didn't share that one. Do you know if I can go back at all? It does not let me go back. Or maybe if I click over. So when we look at Wisconsin, out of all the tribes that were here, when I had the slide, let's do this. I can go without the slide. So Ojibwe, Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and Potawatomi were all here. The Oneida and the Stockbridge Mohicans came to us from New York area. And the government made a march. So like we learned about the Cherokee Trail of Tears, but we never learned about how other tribes are forced to march too. And so that one's about the Choctaw Trail of Tears. But in Wisconsin, the Oneida and the Stockbridge Mohicans had to walk here from New York. So that's another one that it's important to know that history, that this isn't their traditional land, but this is where they are now. So there's a bunch of books over there, and then the kids' books. My favorite kids' book, this one, as you can tell my kids, it's in English and in Ojibwe, and so when I read to students, I like to read this in classrooms too, because it uses Ojibwe language. I just think it's important to do that. I like to read, for younger kids, Where Did You Get Your Moccasins? Because it's a contemporary story, because I like the stuff in the present. Another one is The Jingle Dancer, again, contemporary. She wants to dance at a powwow, and so she has to make a dress and borrow jingles, and it's a really good story, contemporary. So there's just some books there. Yeah, do you have a question?
Have you read Green Street Grass?
Sitting over there. I started it, I have not finished it. I'm really bad about sometimes finishing books because I start and I get distracted, and I have it there. There's some other ones too. What is it? Two Spirit. So for our LGBTQ community, as Indigenous people, we believe in 5 genders. We support our LGBTQ community. It's traditional to support them, but with Christianity and kind of residential schools like that, those beliefs have been removed. And so sometimes there is some bias and hate towards LGBTQ. And so I try to get back to the traditional pieces and understanding that. So that's another topic that, yeah.
What's the resources now to maintain the culture and language, passing it along? What resources do you have?
Yeah, good question. So my grandpa was born up by Hayward, and he moved away after World War II, and so he could understand Ojibwe, but because his mom was Ojibwe and his dad was white, they weren't really accepted on the reservation, and they weren't really accepted in town, so they lived on the edge of town. And my grandpa went to school in town, so like he avoided residential school, but he was already going to a school there. So he moved away and did not pass on any Ojibwe to my dad, and then we never moved back up there. So for us, learning, when I worked at the Ho-Chunk Nation, my kids would learn Ho-Chunk, but then we would at home try and learn Ojibwe where we could. All of our pets have Ojibwe names, so that's kind of, we try and include pieces, but as someone who doesn't have a language teacher, but there are a lot of really great apps, different books, like Facebook has some really great people that are willing to share the language on Facebook, and so there are just different ways. And then the University of Minnesota, Duluth, I think it is, has one of the largest online Ojibwe dictionaries, which is where we'll look up words and try and learn. I like to tell my kids that even though my dad's an enrolled tribal member, I am not. But my kids have been raised with more Indigenous knowledge than my dad was, because I tried to do what I could as a parent. Whereas I think it became for my grandpa and even my dad, it was kind of easier to pass as white. And so just trying to pass on that piece. But they also learn Norwegian, because my husband is Norwegian and my father-in-law speaks better Norse than he does English. They also know Norwegian, and so they have a balance in their culture.
There's a center in La Crosse. Is that Ho-Chunk?
Yeah, the Three Rivers.
Is there classes there at all?
For Ho-Chunk, yeah, that's where my kids learned Ho-Chunk was there. Yeah, but to learn Ojibwe, you almost have to live on a reservation, and that started too, like in the 1970s was that when they did they promised Indigenous people homes and stuff in big cities to move them off reservations, and they would get to the big cities and then there wouldn't be anything there and they were kind of stuck. And that was just kind of another way of removing them from the culture and the language. Yeah.
So cultural practices and how do you learn?
Reading, knowing other Indigenous people, we have an interesting mixture in our house of beliefs and practices, right? Yeah. So we do what we can. Nobody really is 100% traditional anymore unless they're living off on a reservation without any interaction with other groups. Like it's impossible to say you're 100% traditional nowadays.
So everybody has to individually search wherever there's no organized language camp or...
If you live on a reservation or live by a reservation, you can. It does get harder if you're not connected directly. So, but like I said, we've tried in our house to do what we can to, but also understand those pieces and support where we can. Yeah.
So with the residential schools, if there's mass graves, that would imply that a lot were killed at the same time, or died at the same time, as opposed to one here and one there. What's the thinking behind mass?
A lot of it, I think, is tied to the poor diet and the disease that would come through. So, like if there was influenza or some of that. Were there kids that just disappeared? Yeah, but I don't know that, like you said, if it would necessarily be the mass graves, but it sure could be. I don't know that we'll ever know exactly that because that's the churches and the different groups that run the schools. They know that, but it's what was documented and what will be shared.
Are anyone in Wisconsin set up museums for education?
Yeah, so the one at Toma is by the hospital. It's on the same grounds as the hospital in the VA. It's there. One of them is the one in Lac de Flambeau, and I love this story. They have turned theirs into a cultural center. So what a way to take that, and then there was like huge discussion too about how what it was built for and now what's being done. Like there's just some like there was some feelings, obviously, like maybe we shouldn't, but then I think it became, what a better way to use the space than to do that. So,
I was just thinking like touring concentration camps, you know, like it's grim, but it's an education.
and there's another one too, and I can't remember if it's the Stockbridge Muncie or Menominee. I know one of them is set up where you can tour, because I toured that one, where you can go through and see what it was like. So I do know that there's a couple, at least in Wisconsin. It's hard to know 50 states and all that. Like I try and focus on Wisconsin knowledge because I can live my whole life and still never know like fully Ojibwe history, because in Ojibwe, like in Indigenous culture, you are kind of, what your clan is what you're supposed to learn, and then your gender too, like we have specific kind of roles. And so like you can never really know all the other clan roles and all the other pieces, so. And it's definitely hard when we talk about Indigenous tribes, which that wasn't even a question I asked. Does anybody know how many federally recognized tribes are in the U.S.?
I just heard this like 2 weeks ago, and now I'm trying to struggle to bring up the number.
Now I'm going to double check that because it's always changing. To like it depends on who gets federal recognition. And I feel like it's over 700. Let's double check this. Because now I asked that question and I'm like, oh, I should double check the number before I ask that question. At least I. And like I said, so there are those different things that they need to have to be federally recognized. One is land, one is language, kind of the different things like that. What's the number? I don't think it's 700 some, but now I'm like, on the spot, shouldn't ask that question. So you stick to what you were going to ask. But yeah, there's like over 700 federally recognized tribes, so in the U.S. But I think we're probably close to time, and I'm more than happy to keep answering questions. I feel like I babbled. My typical presentation, lots of babbling. I mean, there's so much to share. Like, I mean, when it comes to all of it and like resources, I love talking to students. One of the things we do too is we'll go talk. We use brown bear, and then we actually use the ho-chunk words that for color and animals, because usually we're on a ho-chunk land, and so that's my kids will help me do that and do the animals and the colors, just so kids can hear language, different language. Yeah. Any other questions? Like, no, please stop talking. All right, one little Indigenous culture piece, we don't say goodbye, we just say see you later, because when you say goodbye, that means goodbye is goodbye. So I'll just say see you later, and then I'm just going to say chimigwich, which is thank you a lot. And in Ho-Chunk, it's pinagigi, which means thank you for all that you do for me. And so I will just say, if one thing you could do for me today is just share one thing you learned with someone else. I believe in the ripple effect and how that like spreads out, and so I appreciate it. So I think I have just contact info too. If anyone wants to contact or follow up with questions, more than happy to do that. So thank you.
Thank you. I'll just hit stop here.